Okay, Cloud Gurus, authentication, or Auth-N if you're in that type of mood. It's all about proving you are who you say you are. And that's it. Requests come into the API server with creds attached, they get checked, and the authentication module says either, yep, authorized user, or no, dirty imposter. And of course, Kubernetes being Kubernetes, it's configurable, right? So out of the bag, you get like 2 or 3 options. I think bearer tokens, client certificates, and bootstrap tokens. And you can have them all enabled at the same time. That is totally fair game. Oh, and you can use things like OpenID Connect to hook into Active Directory and maybe your IAM providers. That's like the enterprise option, yeah? But that really is it. Prove that you are who you say you are. But there's an elephant in the room. Kubernetes does not do users. Let that sink in. There is no facility for Kubernetes to store and manage user accounts, at least not regular users. That means no user resource in the API, which means all regular users must be created and managed outside of the cluster. And you know what? When I was taking a beating from RBAC at around like the 1.6 release, I'm telling you, this was a revelation to me, and I'll admit it, right? I struggled to get my head around it. So in case it's new to you or you're finding it hard as well, let me take a minute to explain. Like I've said, you cannot create users in Kubernetes. So if you want to lock things down with users and groups, which I promise you do, you're going to have to manage those outside of the cluster. But it can totally be Active Directory or your cloud's IAM provider, or it can just be a list of bearer tokens or maybe client certs. And when you think about it, it makes total sense. I mean, when I was working in the enterprise, I was crying out for solutions to leverage our corporate AD, because I had zero desire to maintain another user database. So now that I've got my head around it, I'm loving this. So an authentication flow goes a bit like this. You post your requests to the API server with your creds embedded. They get passed off to some external system in some way, right? Big hand wave going on here because it's all different depending on which authenticators you're using. But that authentication system either says yes, approved, or no, rejected. Easy. A really simple example is client certificates. Every cluster I've ever worked on gets a CA. You can use that CA to mint user certificates. You embed usernames in the CN property of the certificate, and any groups get listed as organizations, or the O property. Then you create a kubectl context so that your certificate gets embedded with all future commands. Then when you post your requests to the API server, it checks your embedded cert against the CA and says, yep, that's one of ours, or no, not created here. And that's it. Now that's a simple example, but it's dead easy to configure, and it's worked like that for ages. I mean, yeah, better and more scalable solutions exist, but they're a bit more involved and a bit more technology specific, like integrating an AKS cluster with Azure Active Directory using OpenID Connect. Brilliant, right? But there's a ton of them like that, and I'm sorry, we've not got the time to go through every option, but I hope you get the picture. Now then, what we've been talking about here are regular users for humans like us to use with our kubectl commands. But there's another type of user called a service account, and those are stored in Kubernetes. Only they're not for you and me to use. They're for system components like kubelets in the different parts of the control plane. Because remember, they need to authenticate with the API server as well. So, for the most part, right, service accounts are created and managed by the cluster. Most of them live in the kube system namespace, and their credentials are stored in secrets. Great, but from a strategic security perspective, you need to give some thought as to how you want to manage these. So, like, do you want every object in the namespace to have its own service account? Okay, maybe you do, but probably not. I don't know, it seems a bit overkill. Maybe one per deployment or something might be a good idea. As usual though, it's a trade-off with like the more granular generally being the better, but harder to manage. So it's your call, choose what's best for your environment. The point is, every pod and every member of the control plane that interacts with the API server gets associated with a service account. and that service account is the identity they use when authenticating with the API server. Fabuloso! So, a request comes into the API server, and it doesn't matter if it's from kubectl or a system component. Here's one here from kubectl, right? This unfolds to this, which is basically a question asking, can Nigel create new deployments in the ACG namespace? Okay, authentication is the first component to step up to the plate, and it just makes sure that the request really is coming from Nigel. Once that's done, it's on to authorization. Speaking of which, that's where we're going next.